Welcome to the Second World War at Sea from Avalanche Press rules walkthrough. We're going to cover the battle game in this walkthrough and give you a little sample battle. What this is not is an unboxing video. There's loads of unboxing videos, and to me those don't help out terribly much. I've been playing Avalanche Press games for about 20 years, and for me, with my learning style, it's been a little difficult without having somebody to show me how to do it. So I'm hoping that this gets you up and running in the World War II sea games without too much muss and fuss. Now there are two main parts to the Avalanche Press system here. One is the campaign game, which is where all of the decisions about where fleets go and how they move and how you search for them. We're not going to cover that in this particular video. We'll do that at a later point. We're going to focus on the battle game, which is using the tactical map and where you use the ship counters and actually conduct combat and move against each other in a combat fashion. We're going to be using the second edition rules for the game, which are the current rules that ship with most of the boxes, current being November 2022. Another note is that I'm going to be using a VASSAL module to teach this section, and the games are not currently available on VASSAL. I built this myself, and I don't have permission to distribute it, so it's just being used for demo purposes. The great thing about doing that for a how-to video is that you don't have to lay things out on the table and have the cat sit on them or move back and forth between different days of working on it, or having to set up the lighting with the cameras and all that. It's just going to be a better way to show how to do it. If I ever do get permission to distribute VASSAL modules, I will note that in the area below. This is the tactical map. This is the map that you're going to use to maneuver your ships and to show combat between the different pieces. We're also not going to cover air power in this video. We're going to do that in a separate video. Most games, most of the scenarios actually involve air power, but I think it's easier to get through the turn sequence first when you are when you're using just the regular pieces. So we'll get back to that in a different video, and I think that will make this a lot more interesting. We're going to start by adding the Japanese fast battleship Hiei onto the tactical map. You'll notice in the upper left-hand corner you see the ensign of the Navy that it represents, in this case Japanese, and then you will see that it has a hull number and then a speed factor, which ranges from 1 to 4. So this is actually really quite a fast ship. Next to it are the gunnery factors. The first number is the primary gunnery factor. The second number is the secondary gunnery factor, like the 8-inch guns. And then the third one is a tertiary gun factor. So these would be smaller guns, 5-6 inches and lower, and they would be pretty much the same. They'd be used on destroyers and things like that. In the center, you see this beautiful, beautiful outline of the ship that's drawn by Avalanche Press. And honestly, these are what made me want to come and play this. I love outlines of ships, and I think these are just little gems. On the bottom line, you'll see the name of the ship, and then you'll see a number of different icons. A green icon there is going to be torpedoes. The blue icon is for search planes, and the third icon there, the red circle, is the anti-aircraft factors. And these are all explained. We're going to explain them in a little bit. So that has most of the information you need during the game. And then the ship data sheet, which we'll talk about in a second, has a little more data that you might need as you play. Here is the ship data sheet that includes the battleship Hiei. Now there are multiple battleships in the game, of course, and many data sheets. So you're going to need to pick through and find what you like or what you need to use. So you're probably going to be best advised to Xerox these and then cut them apart and then paste them back together, because you probably don't need all the ships that are shown in any one of these sheets. Now, across the line, you see the battleship's hull number, you see its name. In parentheses, you see the point value if you're adding up points to see who won the game. Next to that, you're going to see the gunnery factors, primary, secondary, and tertiary. When you look at the gunnery factors, you notice that they're going to be one of 3 separate shadings. First, they can be entirely solid gray, which means that they can only be damaged by primary gunnery from the enemy. They could be slashed lines, and that means they can be damaged by secondary or primary gunnery from the enemy. Or they can be an empty square, which means that they can be damaged by any gunnery from the enemy. This is pretty typical that the tertiaries are not really terribly well armored. You can usually see these in World War II ships by very light armor on the casemates around the guns. After that, you'll see the torpedo factors. In this case, only the destroyer has a torpedo factor. And you can also see that it has a long lance, LL, which means that it uses the special Japanese torpedoes, and we'll get to that in a little bit. After that's the speed, and then there's a lot of space around the speed. And you're going to need that because during the game, you're going to lose speed. So you're going to be crossing that out and putting in the new speed as you go. After that is anti-aircraft, and then after that is hull. And the hull, again, shows the armor shading. So it's either going to be solid gray, slashed lines, which means secondary can penetrate it, or it's going to be open boxes, which means even tertiary can penetrate it. You're also going to see on some of the ships, in fact, one of the ships we're going to use in our walkthrough, a black box around the entire hull section. That indicates that that particular ship has deck armor to protect it from plunging fire, which means that in a plunging fire situation, which is at ranges of 6 or more, you might get a hit that's going to do more damage than normal because of the angle of the shell coming into the target. In this case, that's going to be prevented. And then finally, you have fuel boxes. The fuel boxes are used during the campaign game, and I would suggest you use pencil on these because you are able in the campaign game to refuel. So you're going to want to be able to open those back up so that you can use them as you go. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the ship data sheet, and you're going to use this throughout the game, quite obviously. A little note on the ship data sheets is that they are available from Avalanche Press for download in Excel format and from a number of other sources. So take a look around the web and you can find those and download them, and that way it might be easier for you to arrange them into just the right ships for the scenario that you're playing. To play a battle scenario, you're going to use sections 6 through 8 of the 2nd edition rules, which came with your game. We're going to talk about some of the rules, but there's other rules in there that we're not going to cover that don't come up quite as often or that don't require explanation, in my opinion. Placement of the ships and movement is a little bit complicated in this system. The turn is actually based on 4 segments of each of 22 impulses. We're going to go ahead and describe the turn sequence at the same time as we're placing the ships on the page. We're going to make a swap partway through because I'm going to show you a lot of the rules for placing and getting ships onto the page. And then I'm going to talk about a smaller group of ships and go through all the combat and movement phases just because it's going to be easier to show. To start the game, you roll for initiative. On a 4, 5, or 6, the allied player gets initiative. On a 1, 2, or 3, the Axis player gets initiative. The person with the initiative gets to place his unit second and gets to determine some of the important parts of the setup of the battle and tends to fire second, forcing the non-initiative player to make decisions first so that the initiative player can respond to those. The first impulse is to determine who has initiative. You only really need this in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rounds of the turn because you know who has the initiative going in initially. In this case, it's the Axis. So the Axis player is going to start dragging ships out and placing them on the board. And he's going to go ahead and pick some cruisers here and some destroyers, and we're going to get a full stack. Now, I'm putting these in 2 separate piles so that you can get a good idea of what ships are here, and then we're going to move them around and actually put them where they're supposed to be on the board. Stacking is allowed for 12 units per hex. However, each cruiser, each capital ship counts as 2. So in this case, I've got 2 stacks in 2 hexes of 6 each. I have 2 cruisers for 6 points and 2 destroyers for 2 points. And then we're going to move them all together, and then we're going to put them up onto their entry hex. Now, since they are the non-initiative player, it's kind of a courtesy to place them kind of far out on the edge there, because you're going to need that extra space to put the initiative player, and if you don't have them right, you're going to have to move everything. We're going to do that in the next little bit here as we place the Americans on the page. Now, you're supposed to bring your units in one of these dark blue areas. So C1, D1, Z1, or C11, D16. But we're going to put them out here, and then we're going to drag them to the right place. The bottom line is that you need to have your fleets at least 6 hexes apart. And you count, obviously, starting from the hex after you and ending up on the target hex, or from your hex to the hex before the target. So you have to have 6 hexes between them when you're done. So we're going to finish up dropping the Americans on here, and then we can go ahead and move these to the right place, which should happen now. Now I have to move these just a little bit more to get them in the right spots because they need to be 6 hexes apart. But while I'm doing this, I also want to state that there's one particular section here that's a little interesting in the rules, and that is that ships may enter the same hex from different fleets, but you need to have the stacking for each fleet in that hex. So you can have 12 factors or 12 ships of the Japanese Navy and 12 of the US Navy in the same hex. So I'm just going to drag those in here and show you that that would be legal. That would probably be a big slaughter fest, but that would be legal. So 12 from each side. And remember, cruisers and capital ships count as 2 ships, and the small ships count as 1. We're actually going to swap ships around here just a little bit and get rid of those big stacks because I want to move to a smaller group of ships for the combat demonstrations. In Impulse 2, the non-initiative player, the Japanese player, moves all of his or her groups with a speed of 4, 3, or 2. In Phase 3, the initiative player moves all of his groups with a speed of 4, 3, or 2. In this case, the battleship there is the slowest speed, and it's a 2+, so it still counts as a 2, and it moves in this phase. In Phase 4, both sides conduct their gunnery combat. It doesn't really matter what order you execute the gunnery combat because all the damage is going to be concurrent, and you don't count that till the end of the turn. So if you knock out some guns on a ship, they still get to fire in this phase. Now remember, it doesn't matter in which order you fire because all the gunfire is concurrent. We're going to start by firing the North Carolina at the Congo, and we've rolled 14 dice, 1 for each of her primary gunnery factors, and we're going to count the number of 6s, and then we're going to see where those hits land. Now to find out where the hits land, compare the red die rolls here on the screen with your gunnery table on the tactical map, which looks like this. In the center is the gunnery damage table. The gunnery damage table, there's a set of die rolls from 2 to 12, and that tells you where the hit has landed. That you mark off on the ship data sheet. If you roll a 12, you actually roll a critical damage hit, which is really good, and that has a lot more hull hits or primary hits that you can take off. On the left-hand side is the torpedo damage table, and that tells you where to put the damage on the SDS for the torpedoes. In my Vassal module, it's in a separate chart, but in your box, it's going to be on the side of your tactical chart. In the ship data sheet, go and find the target, in this case, the Congo, and mark off the damage that has been done by the shelling. You're going to do this for each individual die roll that you hit. In its opening salvo, the North Carolina has done 2 hull damage, 1 secondary damage, and 1 tertiary damage to the Congo. That's a pretty good hit. Now, because the damage is concurrent, the Congo is going to fire at the North Carolina, and she has 8 guns, and she rolls 3 hits, which will go ahead and take off the North Carolina here. The first shot gives us, let's see here, 1 tertiary gun. The next shot gives us a critical hit, which puts off 2 hull boxes and reduces the speed by 1. That's pretty impressive. Now remember, the range now is 5, so that means that only the primary guns can fire. As soon as the range reduces to 4, then the secondary guns can also fire, so we should see those in the next impulse. Impulse 5, both sides conduct torpedo combat. Now we're outside the range of normal torpedo combat, which is 2 hexes, and outside the range of the Japanese long lance combat, which is 4. Impulse 6, the non-initiative player moves all of his or her groups with a speed of 4, 3, or 1. The ships there have a speed of 4 because the Congo hasn't lost enough hull boxes to lose any speed. So they're going to move. Remember that each stack moves at the speed of the slowest ship in the stack. So the American task force is going to move at a speed of 2, even though the destroyer and the cruiser are faster. But since the speed is only 2, and this is only for 4, 3, and 1, then none of the American ships are going to move. Impulse 8. Both sides conduct gunnery combat. We're going to start with the North Carolina again. The North Carolina still has 14 guns, so the North Carolina is going to roll 14 hit dice. And it gets 4 separate hits. The first die roll is a 4, which is a hull hit. The second die roll is an 11, which is 2 hull and lose 1 speed, and a 9, which is a primary gun hit, and a 7, which is a primary gun hit. So the North Carolina has really started to do a number on the Congo. The Congo fires back at the North Carolina and does 3 damage hits. You see the 3 6s. It rolled a 9, a 7, and a 6. The 9 is a primary, the 7 is a primary, and the 6 is a secondary. Now, the North Carolina doesn't have any secondary guns, so the third hit becomes a tertiary hit. Now the Congo's secondary batteries fire, and they get 1 hit with a 6, and then the die hit is the damage is a 7. The 7 is a primary gun, but a secondary gun factor can't damage a primary armored gun. So there's no damage for the Congo's secondary armament in this impulse. Now the Helena fires her 6 factors, and she hits 1 time on the Congo, but because the Congo only has secondary armor on the hull hit actually does do damage. So now the Congo is almost at half hull strength. It's not looking good for the IJN at this point. Now both players conduct torpedo combat. Because the American torpedoes are short-ranged, they aren't going to be able to fire this turn. But the Japanese long-lance torpedoes have a range of 4. So if you fire a long-lance torpedo at the range of 4, you quarter the number of factors available. So in this case, it's going to be 1. If you are firing at 3 hexes, you take half the number of factors available, or 2. And if you're firing at 1 or 2 hexes, then all torpedoes from all countries have the full number of torpedo factors. You can only fire torpedoes once during the game. Japanese can reload with a long lance, but not in the scope of what we're going to do today. In this case, the Hamikaze is going to fire 4 long lance torpedoes, but they are going to be reduced to 1 factor. She hits, and she does a 5 damage, which is 2 hull and 1 tertiary. In the next movement impulse, the Japanese are rated at 3, but this impulse may only move 4 or 2, so the Japanese will not move. Likewise, the North Carolina is now reduced to a speed of 1, so it won't move either, so both fleets stay in exactly the same positions. After both fleets have moved, we're going to do the gunnery combat, and both sides fire at the same time. So we're going to switch it up a little bit, and we're going to fire the 6 guns from the Helena into the Hamikaze and see if we can get some good damage there. And whoops, that looks like it was enough for the Hamikaze to end the day, as the Hamikaze has lost 2 hull hits, which is the last of its hull, and therefore it sinks at the end of the gunnery phase. Now the Haie is going to fire, and she rolls no hits, and so we're going to go on and fire the 3 guns of the Hamikaze's secondary battery at the Helena, but it doesn't hit either. Now the North Carolina is going to fire its 14 main guns, and it's going to get one hit, and then a second hit, and then a third hit, and that's going to take damage off of the hull, and then 2 more damage off of the hull and a reduction in speed, and then finally it's going to reduce the last anti-aircraft factor. Now the Congo is going to be dead in the water next impulse because it's taken a speed hit. Now looking at the ship data sheet, we can see that the Hamiakaze has lost both of its hull hits, so it will now sink. Bye. Now comes torpedo combat, and at this point neither side has torpedo combat. The destroyer from the Japanese is sunk, and the American destroyer is out of range. Non-initiative player moves all of his or her groups with a speed of 4, 3, or 1. Now we've made a mistake here, and we've actually moved the Congo because the Congo lost a speed factor last turn, so it should not have moved this turn, and its movement is 2. But it's easier to just explain it than to re-record it. Now comes Impulse 15. The initiative player moves all of his groups with a speed of 4, 3, or 1. Now comes Impulse 16. Both players conduct surface gunnery combat. The North Carolina is going to start by firing its guns, which is now at 12 guns, to the Congo, and it's going to get itself 4 hits, which will finish up the hull, and then the Congo sinks. Technically speaking, the Congo has the right to fire back at this phase, but we've really determined the outcome of the game, so I'm going to stop there with the combat and then go on to Impulse 18. The non-initiative player, which is all sunk, can move. Then the initiative player moves all of his groups. Then both players conduct gunnery combat. Then both players conduct torpedo combat. And then in turn 22, or Impulse 22, you can attempt emergency repairs and to click for disengagement. So there you have a walkthrough of the tactical rules for the Avalanche Press World War II at Sea games, and these examples are from Midway. We will be doing more of these videos over the next few weeks. It takes a little bit of time to make them, but I intend to show how to use the air rules, how to do a couple more sample combats, and then how to do the campaign rules. If you follow along with this in your rules, you should be up and playing pretty quickly. Also, once we get to the campaign game, we can have quite a bit more fun about the real core of the game, which is the missions and the refueling and the searching and finding the enemy, which is really the most important part and the most interesting part of the game system. At any rate, thank you very much for listening, and be sure to go and buy a copy of one of the Avalanche Press games. They're all good. I just got Coral Sea a week ago, and I'll be doing some videos on that as well. But not an unboxing video. Never an unboxing video. Never. One last thing before you go. I know that there are mistakes here. Please let me know what they are. I can correct them and get a new version of this out. I haven't been playing as consistently as I'd like to, so I very much value any input you might have. Thanks again.